I will not kneel to you." The black boy told the king, "I will protect my mother." The palace was already awake when Kairo heard the screams. They cut through the morning air like blades, sharp, panicked, desperate. At first he thought the sound belonged to one of the kitchen girls or maybe a servant who had dropped a silver tray. But then he heard a second voice layered beneath the first, ragged and trembling, and his heart stopped. It was his mother. Kairo abandoned the bucket he was carrying, the water sloshing across the stone floor, and sprinted down the corridor. His bare feet slapped against the cold marble, breath burning his lungs as he turned the corner toward the courtyard. A group of guards marched across it, 4 of them, surrounding a woman whose wrists were bound and whose steps barely held her upright. His mother, her hair, normally tied neatly beneath her work scarf, had loosened in the struggle, curls falling across her cheeks. Her lip was split. Her eyes, those warm, tired eyes he had always known, were wide with pain and confusion. Kairo's voice cracked. "Mine!" One of the guards turned sharply. "Get back, boy!" But Kairo ignored him. He ran faster, weaving between bushes and barrels, his small feet bleeding on the gravel as he tried to reach her. His mother saw him and shook her head desperately. "No, Kairo," she whispered. "Stay back. Stay safe. Stay safe." She had told him that his whole life, when nobles insulted him, when other servants mocked his skin, when the king's advisor passed by and the air itself seemed to shrink in fear. Stay safe. Hide your anger. Lower your gaze. Survive. But today, the command shattered against the sight before him, because the guards were not dragging his mother to the servants' quarters for punishment. They were pulling her toward the throne room, toward the king. Kairo's heart pounded violently. "Why are you taking her?" he shouted. "She didn't do anything." The advisor appeared then, stepping from the shadows like a poison made flesh. He was dressed in rich blue robes, gold chains glinting across his chest. His eyes, cold, pale, and full of centuries of prejudice, landed on Kairo with visible disgust. "You," he said, pointing a jeweled finger at the boy, "will remain silent. Your mother is being brought before the king for crimes against the crown." Crimes against the crown. Kairo felt the world tilt beneath him. That's a lie. She would never. "Enough," the advisor snapped. "She has been accused." "Accused by who?" Kairo demanded. A cruel smile twisted the man's lips. "By me," his mother gasped. "You know I didn't." "She dared to question my authority," the advisor barked. "She disrespected the crown. She stole a brooch from the royal treasury." "I didn't," she cried. "Please, I didn't take anything." Of course she didn't. Kairo knew it before she even spoke. His mother had nothing. No jewels, no gold, no fine clothes. She barely had food on some days, but she had dignity, and for men like the advisor, that was enough reason to crush her. "This is wrong," Kairo shouted. "You're lying." The advisor stepped closer, looming over him. "And what will you do, little servant? You think the king wants to hear your voice?" He leaned in. "He doesn't even know you exist." Kairo's fists shook. He wanted to scream, to hit, to fight. But the guards were already dragging his mother away. She twisted her neck, looking back at him, eyes flooding with fear, not for herself, but for him. "Kairo," she pleaded, "stay away from the throne room. Promise me." He opened his mouth to speak, but she was pulled around the corner, swallowed by the towering golden doors of the throne hall. Then he heard the advisory whisper to the guards, thinking Kairo was too far to hear. "Make sure she kneels. The king prefers when they kneel." Kairo froze. Kneel. That word tasted like ashes in his mouth. He saw the bloody scrapes on his mother's knees, the bruises forming on her wrists, the humiliation forced upon her every day of her life. He saw her body bent in exhaustion, bent in fear, bent in obedience, bent so long that the kingdom forgot she could stand. Kairo felt heat surge through his veins, hotter than pain, hotter than fear. "No," he whispered. He wasn't going to stay away. He wasn't going to hide. He turned and sprinted toward the throne room, dodging startled servants, ignoring the cries telling him to stop. Sweat streaked down his face. His lungs screamed for air, his legs almost buckled under him, but he kept running. When he reached the massive doors, he didn't hesitate. He pushed them open. Gasps filled the hall. Nobles turned. Guards reached for their swords, but Kairo saw only one thing: his mother, forced to her knees before the king, her head bowed, her hands shaking, her dignity stripped by lies. Something in Kairo snapped. The king rose, looming above everyone like a shadow carved into stone. His voice thundered, "Boy, kneel before your king." Kairo's breath steadied. His heart stopped trembling. He walked forward, one step, then another, past guards, past nobles, past the advisor. He placed himself between his mother and the throne. He lifted his chin, and with all the courage he had ever held inside him, he answered, "I will not kneel to you." The throne room fell silent. Kairo's voice did not. He placed a hand on his mother's shoulder and declared, "I will protect my mother." And in that moment, before the crowd, before the guards, before the king, the fate of the kingdom changed. Kairo had grown up inside the palace walls, but nothing about his childhood felt royal. The stone corridors were cold, the nobles colder, and the only warmth he ever knew came from his mother's hands. Hands roughened by years of scrubbing floors, washing linens, and carrying burdens no one ever thanked her for. She worked in silence, moved in silence, survived in silence. And that silence shaped Kairo long before he understood what it cost her. He remembered being very small, small enough that his head barely reached her hip, when he first noticed that she never walked through the palace with her eyes raised. She always kept them lowered, not in shame, but in strategy. She knew every glance could be misinterpreted, every movement judged, every breath taken as insolence. Kairo didn't understand then why she bowed so often, why she worked twice as hard, why she apologized even when she had done nothing wrong. But he learned. He learned from the way the kitchen staff talked about her when they thought he wasn't listening. Whispers layered with contempt disguised as politeness. She should be grateful she even has a place here. Those people never know their place. Her boy is trouble waiting to happen. He learned from the way nobles wrinkled their noses when she walked past, the way their eyes dragged across her skin as though her existence offended them. He learned from the laundry room where his mother spent endless hours bent over boiling water, her dark skin shining with sweat, her shoulders tight with effort. He learned from the bruises she tried to hide under her sleeves. She never told him how she got them, but he always knew. Maybe a guard shoved her out of the way. Maybe a noblewoman slapped her for folding a dress incorrectly. Maybe the advisor brushed too close, his hand cruel in the way he squeezed her arm. She never said a word. She simply kept working, kept breathing, kept holding her chin high in the small private moments when no one else could see. One night, when Kairo was 8, he woke to hear muffled sobs behind the thin curtain that separated their beds in the servants' quarters. The sound terrified him because it didn't sound like his mother. It sounded like the shattering of something strong. He crawled quietly toward her and saw her hunched over, clutching her own hands, as if afraid that letting go of herself would make her fall apart entirely. "Mine?" he whispered. "What's wrong?" She had wiped her tears so quickly, it was as if they had never existed. "Nothing, mio figlio, go back to sleep." "But you're crying." "No," she said gently, cupping his cheek. "I'm praying." Kairo didn't understand the difference then. Later, he learned that for people like them, prayer and pain often looked the same. The palace expected servants to be invisible, but Kairo was never invisible. He had his mother's deep brown skin and her tightly curled hair, and these alone were enough to draw eyes, curious eyes, suspicious eyes, hateful eyes. He grew accustomed to the stares. He learned to shrink under them. But the worst part, the part that followed him even when he closed his eyes at night, was how those same eyes landed on his mother. They did not look at her with curiosity. They looked at her with ownership, as if the palace believed she existed to be used, punished, controlled. Kairo saw her straighten her back every time a guard passed, pretending she wasn't afraid. He saw her tighten her hand around his whenever nobles walked by, as though bracing for insult. He watched her swallow her pride, her anger, her voice. Every day, every hour so Kairo could survive. He remembered one morning when they were cleaning the courtyard. A group of noble children skipped through the gardens, laughing and playing. One of them, a boy with golden hair and a cruel smirk, pointed at Kairo. "Why is his skin so dark?" the boy asked loudly. "Is he dirty?" The other children giggled. Their mothers said nothing. Kairo froze, holding a broom twice his height. His mother turned, eyes flashing for only a second before she knelt beside him, her voice almost too calm. "Your skin is beautiful," she whispered in his ear. "Never forget that." But when she stood up, Kairo saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her breath as the noblewoman walked past, as if even defending her own child could bring punishment. It usually did. Some days later, the advisor called her to the back corridor. When she returned, she could barely lift her arm. Kairo saw the bruise that spread across her skin like a painful shadow. She hid it under fabric, but he saw. He always saw. He learned then that silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. His mother carried that armor every day, every moment. She endured humiliation after humiliation, but she never let it touch Kairo, not directly. She stood between him and the cruelty of the palace like a wall built of love, even as the world chipped away at her. And Kairo learned something else too. Every time someone hurt her, she flinched. But every time someone hurt him, she broke. She lived in fear that the kingdom would crush her son the way it crushed her spirit. So she taught him to keep his head down, to stay quiet, to survive by not being seen. But Kairo grew older, and taller, and angrier. He watched the way nobles spat near her feet, the way guards brushed too close, the way the advisor whispered threats dripping with venom, and he began to feel something that frightened his mother more than any punishment: defiance. He felt it first when they called her names, then when they blamed her for things she didn't do, and worst of all, when they made her kneel. Kairo memorized the sight, the bend of her back, the shaking of her hands, the way she closed her eyes to survive the moment, and he swore, deep inside, a vow he never said aloud. One day, she would kneel no more. But that day came sooner than he imagined. And when the guards dragged her toward the throne room, when he heard the advisor accusing her of theft, when he saw her knees hit the marble floor, when he saw her break in a way he had never seen, that lifelong silence inside him finally snapped. And the boy who had been taught to bow stood up. The accusation did not fall from the sky. It was crafted, sharpened like a blade, dipped in poison, and delivered by the one man in the kingdom who saw Kairo's mother not as a person, but as an obstacle that needed to be crushed. The king's advisor had always looked at her with a peculiar hatred, one that went beyond class prejudice. His eyes followed her not with desire, nor with curiosity, but with calculation. He despised her dignity, her quiet strength, her refusal to cower, even when forced to bow. Kairo had felt it for years, the advisor's gaze sweeping the servants' hall like a predator scanning for weakness. He was a man who fed on power, who enjoyed watching others tremble, and the fact that Kairo's mother never fully trembled before him was enough reason for him to want her gone. The first warning sign came days earlier, when Kairo overheard him in the corridor speaking to a nobleman. "That woman has become a problem," he muttered. "She has influence among the others. Servants admire her. They listen to her. They forget their place. Influence." That was the advisor's biggest fear. Not rebellion, not disobedience, but a black woman whom the palace respected more than they should. A woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity that threatened the order he carefully maintained. "She must be reminded where she belongs," he added. Kairo didn't understand what those words meant until the night everything spiraled. He and his mother were in the laundry room, washing linens under dim lantern light. She hummed softly, a tune he recognized from when he was a child, one that made even the cold stones feel warm. That was when the guards arrived. They didn't knock, they didn't explain. They simply stormed in, metal boots clanging on the floor, grabbing her arms before she could even stand. "What are you doing?" she cried, struggling. "What is this?" "On orders of the royal advisor," One of the guards barked. Kairo jumped to his feet. "Let her go!" A guard shoved him aside, hard enough that he hit the wall. "Your mother is under suspicion," the guard said. "She's being taken to the throne hall." "Suspicion of what?" she demanded. That was when the advisor appeared at the doorway, framed by the golden lantern light as if he meant to cast a shadow over the entire room. "Suspicion of theft." Kairo's mother froze. For a moment, confusion flashed through her eyes, followed by terror. "I have never stolen anything," she said, her voice trembling. The advisor stepped deeper into the room, a cruel smile forming. "A jeweled brooch is missing from the royal treasury. Your presence was recorded near the chamber." "That's impossible," she whispered. "I don't enter those rooms." "You deny it?" he asked. "I deny everything." "Then you will explain it to the king," he said, smug. "Guards, bring her." Kairo threw himself at them, kicking, screaming, clawing, anything to slow them down. But he was a child. They were men trained for war. One guard struck him across the face with the back of his hand, sending him crashing to the ground. "Kairo!" his mother screamed. "Don't hurt him!" But the guards didn't look back. They marched her away, leaving Kairo kneeling on the cold stone floor, clutching his stinging cheek, tears flooding his vision. He lifted his head and looked at the advisor, really looked at him. For the first time, Kairo saw the truth behind his smile. The brooch was never stolen. The accusation was never real. This was not about a crime. This was about removing her. "Why are you doing this?" Kairo demanded through tears. The advisor walked toward him slowly, crouching until his pale face hovered inches from Kairo's. "Because," he whispered, "your mother has forgotten her place." Kairo's hands curled into fists. "And because," the advisor added, lowering his voice even more, "I do not like what she represents." Kairo's breath caught. He knew exactly what that meant. Her skin, her strength, her dignity despite her color and status, her refusal to break. "She threatens the order of this palace," the advisor finished. "She makes others believe they deserve to be treated as equals." His lips curled. "We can't have that." Kairo swallowed the rage rising inside him. "She didn't steal anything." The advisor's smile widened. "That will not matter when she kneels before the king." At that moment, before the guards dragged her through the corridor, before the golden doors swallowed her, before the kingdom judged her in front of nobles, Kairo understood. They weren't punishing her for a crime. They were punishing her for existing. He ran after the guards, ignoring the blood dripping from his cheek. Even as they slammed the throne room doors in his face, locking him out, he stayed. He beat the door with his fists, calling her name, begging them to let him in. But the advisor's voice echoed through the wood. "Make sure she kneels." Kairo's breath hitched. He pressed his forehead to the cold door, tears and sweat mixing together. He thought of all the times he saw his mother kneel, under orders, under threats, under cruelty, kneeling to survive, kneeling because she had no choice, kneeling because the kingdom demanded it. No more. He stepped back from the doors. His heart pounded. His blood boiled. The advisor didn't know it yet, but he had made the worst mistake of his life. Because when he forced Kairo's mother to kneel, he taught her son to stand. And stand he would, in the throne room, in front of guards, in front of nobles, in front of the king himself. No matter the cost. And when Kairo saw her collapse under the weight of that false accusation, when he heard the king give the order to kneel, when the advisor smirked behind her, he would break every rule of the kingdom to reach her. Even if it meant saying the words no servant had ever dared speak aloud. The throne room was a place Kairo had only ever seen from a distance. Servants were forbidden to enter unless summoned, and children, especially servant children, were never allowed inside at all. Yet as he sprinted across the courtyard, breath tearing at his lungs, legs trembling beneath him, he knew he didn't care. Rules meant nothing when his mother was being dragged toward judgment that was already decided. He stumbled up the steps leading to the grand doors, nearly slipping on the polished marble. Two guards crossed their spears to block him, their armor glinting under the morning sun. "Get back," one barked. "This is the king's hall." "My mother is inside," Kairo yelled, voice cracking. "Let me through." "Not your place, boy. Go back to the servants' wing." Kairo's heart hammered in his chest. He could still hear the faint echo of voices from within. Muffled commands, whispers of nobles, the sickening laughter of the advisor. Panic surged through him at the thought of his mother kneeling alone before all that power. He took a step forward. "I said move," he repeated, this time louder, fiercer, more desperate. The guards exchanged a look, annoyed at first, then amused. To them, Kairo was a child, a servant, a nobody. And nobodies didn't walk through the king's doors. One guard leaned down, lowering his voice. "You try to enter, we'll throw you in the dungeon." Kairo stared at him, chest rising and falling rapidly. His cheek throbbed from where he'd been struck earlier, and his knees were raw from when he'd fallen running across the courtyard. Every part of him hurt, but none of it mattered. His mother was inside, alone, terrified, and if the advisor had his way, she would leave that hall broken. He stepped back, not to retreat, to run. In one sudden burst of motion, he sprinted straight toward the guards. They shouted, reaching out to grab him, but Kairo ducked beneath their spears, sliding across the polished marble floor. Their hands closed around air as he shot between them like an arrow loosed from a bow. "Stop him!" one guard roared. But it was too late. Kairo slammed his palms against the heavy doors and pushed. The doors groaned open, the golden hinges echoing through the massive hall like thunder. Nobles turned in shock. A curl of silence twisted through the room as every eye landed on the small boy who had just broken the most sacred protocol of the kingdom. He froze for a heartbeat, overwhelmed by the scene before him. The throne room was colossal, vaulted ceilings painted with murals of battles and crowned heroes, columns carved with scenes of conquest, chandeliers sparkling with thousands of crystals that caught the morning light like stars. The king sat at the far end, elevated on a dais of polished stone, wearing a cloak lined with red velvet and fur. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. But Kairo didn't care about the king, or the nobles, or the guards shouting behind him. He saw only her. His mother knelt at the center of the hall, wrists bound, her head bowed so low her forehead nearly touched the floor. Her hair had fallen forward, hiding her face, but he could see her shoulders shaking. The advisor stood behind her, smirking with triumph, as if this moment were a performance staged solely for his pleasure. Kairo's heart shattered. "Mine!" he cried. His mother's head jerked up in panic. "Kairo, no, meo filo, leave! You can't be here!" The king's voice cracked through the hall like a whip. Who allowed this child inside? Guards lunged toward Kairo, but he ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, dodging arms and swords, ignoring nobles who leaped out of the way as he sprinted across the polished floor. He slid to a stop beside his mother, dropping to his knees beside her. He grabbed her shoulders. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here, Mai." Her eyes filled with tears, fear, not relief. "You must leave. Please, Kairo. Please." But he shook his head, gripping her hand tightly. The king rose from his throne, and the hall fell dead silent. He descended the steps slowly, each footstep reverberating like a heartbeat the kingdom couldn't escape. His face was carved into harsh lines, years of authority and cruelty etched into his skin. When he reached the center of the room, he looked down at Kairo with a gaze that could freeze fire. "You dare enter my hall without permission?" he said. Kairo swallowed hard, but didn't look away. "She didn't steal anything. It is not for you to decide," the king answered. "You are a servant." "I'm her son," Kairo said, voice trembling but unbroken. "And she's innocent." The murmur of nobles swept through the room. A son speaking in the throne hall. A servant boy raising his voice to the king. Outrage flared across their faces. The advisor stepped forward, seizing the moment. "Your Majesty, the boy must be punished. Harshly. He has breached royal protocol." The king nodded once, slow and cold. Then he turned back to Kairo. "Kneel," he commanded. Kairo felt his mother tense beside him. She tried to tug his hand, urging him to obey. Her voice cracked. "Kairo, do it, please." But all he could see was every bruise she had ever hidden, every insult she had endured, every time she had been forced to kneel before men who thought the world owned her body, her labor, her life. He rose to his feet. His knees trembled, his voice did not. He lifted his chin, eyes locked on the king, and said the words that sent a gasp rippling across the room. "No!" The king stared at him, stunned. Kairo took one step forward. "No!" he repeated louder. "I won't kneel." The advisor's face twisted in fury. "How dare!" But Kairo wasn't finished. "I won't kneel to you," he said, voice shaking but strong. "Not while my mother is being punished for a lie." His mother sobbed softly, covering her mouth. The king's eyes narrowed. "Child!" Kairo raised his hands, not in surrender, but to shield her, and with a bravery that ached in every bone of his body, he declared, "I will not kneel." Gasps filled the room. The king stepped closer. Guards tightened their grip on their swords. But Kairo, the small servant boy born of silence and survival, stood tall for the first time in his life. And nothing in the kingdom would ever be the same. For a heartbeat, the entire throne room forgot how to breathe. A servant boy had just refused the king's command. Not softly, not trembling, but with a clarity so sharp it sliced through centuries of obedience. Nobles froze mid-gasp, mouths hanging open. Guards stiffened, waiting for the king's signal. Even the advisor, so smug moments before, blinked as if he could not believe what he had just witnessed. The king himself did not move at first. He stood so still he might have been carved of stone, his heavy cloak pooling around his boots, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack. His crown glinted under the chandeliers, catching beams of gold light that made him look even more imposing. Slowly, he stepped closer to Kairo, each footstep echoing like a countdown. "When a king gives a command," he said, voice low and dangerous, "the kingdom obeys." Kairo's heart pounded inside his chest like a drum of war, but he did not look away. He could feel his mother trembling behind him, her fingers gripping his ankle as if begging him to reconsider. But her fear did not weaken him. It fueled him. He had spent his whole life watching her bow to cruelty. He would not bow too. "I'm not the kingdom," Kairo said softly. "I'm her son." The king's nostrils flared. Nobles whispered furiously, "He's insane. He'll be executed." A servant speaking like this? Outrageous. What is the king waiting for? Remove him. But there was something else beneath their outrage. Fear. Not fear of the boy, but fear of what his defiance represented. If one servant boy dared stand, others might too. The advisor stepped forward, eager to regain control. "Your Majesty, I warned you. This woman and her boy have always been trouble. Allow me to—" "Silence," the king snapped. The advisor recoiled, stunned. The king turned back to Kairo. "You refuse to kneel before your ruler." Kairo held his ground. "I refuse to kneel before a man who hurts my mother." A wave of shock rippled through the hall. Someone dropped a goblet. A noblewoman covered her mouth. A guard muttered a curse under his breath. The king descended the last step and stood directly in front of Kairo, towering above him. His breath was hot with anger, and for the first time in his life, Kairo understood why grown men feared him. "Kneel," the king repeated. "Now." Kairo's mother tugged at his leg again, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, Kairo, don't do this. He will kill you." Kairo swallowed the knot in his throat. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to make her suffer more. But he could not kneel. Not today. Not after what they had done to her. He took one step forward, placing himself entirely between the king and his mother. "I will not kneel," he said again, louder. The king's eyes darkened. A guard on the right tightened his grip on his sword. "Your Majesty, give the order." Another guard added, "One strike, and he'll be on the floor." The advisor smirked. "Let the boy learn the price of defiance." The king raised his hand, and every guard in the room prepared to move. Kairo braced himself. His breath came fast. His vision wavered. But he stood tall, not because he was fearless, but because his fear meant nothing compared to his mother's suffering. Before the king's hand could fall, Kairo spoke again, this time with a voice that trembled but did not break. "You hurt her," he said. "You let people like him." He pointed at the advisor. "Treat her like she's nothing. But she works harder than anyone here. She's kind. She's good. And I won't let you break her anymore." The king hesitated. A small, almost imperceptible flicker crossed his eyes. Confusion? Recognition? Something else? Kairo couldn't tell. But the king did not swing. Instead, he lowered his hand slowly, studying the boy with a gaze that had shifted, if only by a fraction. Kairo pressed on. "You don't see her," he said, voice deepening with emotion. "You don't see any of us. You think we're dirt under your boots. But she's my mother. She's my world. And I'll protect her. Even from you." His mother began to cry silently behind him, her tears hitting the marble floor like small drops of surrender. But there was no surrender in Kairo's voice. Only truth. The advisor, recovering from his shock, stepped forward again, fury twisting his features. "Your Majesty, enough of this child's insolence. Order his punishment and—" This time, the king did not merely snap. He roared. "I said silence!" His voice boomed through the hall, rattling the chandeliers, sending the nobles into fearful silence. Even Kairo stiffened at the sound. The advisor staggered back, stunned and humiliated. The king returned his gaze to Kairo. "You speak boldly," he said, his voice quieter now but no less heavy. "Too boldly for someone of your station." Kairo swallowed. "My station doesn't change the truth." The king stared at him for a long, suffocating moment. The hall held its breath. The guards waited for the command to strike. The advisor waited for vengeance. The nobles waited to see justice, or scandal. Finally, the king asked one question. The question no one expected. "Who are you to speak to me like this?" Kairo opened his mouth, but before he could answer, his mother whispered the truth she had held for years. "He is your son." The hall exploded. Nobles shrieked. Guards froze. The advisor stumbled. And the king. The king's face turned ashen, as if someone had ripped open the past he spent years burying. Kairo turned to his mother in shock. "What?" But her eyes were steady, broken, afraid, but steady. And behind him, the king looked at Kairo with a horror deeper than anger. Because the boy standing before him, defiant and unbowed, had just spoken to him with the fire of blood he had tried to erase. And the kingdom realized the truth. He wasn't just a servant. He wasn't just a boy. He was the king's hidden child, and he had refused to kneel. For a long, terrible moment, the words hung in the air like a blade suspended above the kingdom. "He is your son." No one moved. No one breathed. The king's face drained of color, as though the accusation had struck him harder than any sword. The nobles recoiled, whispering frantically behind gloved hands. The guards loosened their grips on their weapons in stunned confusion. And the advisor? The advisor went rigid, his expression twisting with a fury so deep it bordered on panic. Because this was the one truth he had spent years making sure never surfaced. The king's eyes snapped toward the mother. "What did you say?" His voice wasn't loud. It was quiet, trembling, dangerous. A king's voice should never tremble, but this one did. Kairo's mother swallowed, her bound hands shaking. "It is the truth, Your Majesty. He is your blood." The king's breath caught. He stared at her as though seeing her for the first time in years. Not as a servant, not as a woman forced to kneel, but as a ghost from a past he tried to bury. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, his voice came out raw. "Do not speak lies in my hall." Kairo turned to her. "Mai, is it true?" His voice was small, breaking. For the first time since he stormed into the hall, Fear slipped through his bravado. Not fear for himself, but fear of living his entire life without knowing who he truly was. His mother's eyes filled with tears. She reached for him even with her bound wrists. Meu filho, I never wanted you to know like this. What is the meaning of this insanity? A nobleman shouted. A servant's child claiming royal blood? Impossible. Another added. A disgrace, a scandal. Your Majesty, punish them before this spreads. The advisor finally found his voice. It came out brittle at first, then venomous. Your Majesty, this is nothing more than desperation. The woman is cornered. She will say anything to escape punishment. But the mother shook her head, shoulders trembling. I swore I would never speak it. I swore to protect him, even if it meant carrying the shame alone. Kairo stared at her, heat rising to his cheeks, shame and anger twisting inside him. Shame? Why shame? She closed her eyes. Because of who I am, because of the color of my skin, because the kingdom would never accept. The advisor lunged forward, cutting her off. Enough, he barked, his voice sharp as a knife. We will not allow this woman to rewrite history. The king would never disgrace himself with such filth. The word hit Kairo like a punch. Filth. He stepped in front of his mother again, fury shaking him. Don't talk to her like that, the advisor sneered. I will speak however I choose. You are nothing, a servant's brat, a stain in this palace. Kairo's hands balled into fists. I'm not a stain. Yes, the advisor hissed. You are. A mistake that should have never been born. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Kairo felt something inside him fracture, like a wound he never knew he had suddenly tearing open. His mother sobbed behind him. Please stop, please. But the advisor had lost control of himself. Rage poured out like poison he had kept sealed for far too long. Your mother seduced the king, he spat, to gain favor she did not deserve. A servant, a woman like her. She should have known it would lead nowhere. Her place was on the ground, scrubbing floors, not in the king's bed. Silence fell like a death blow. Kairo's breath caught. His mother's entire body shook. The king's eyes widened in something that looked disturbingly like guilt. And the advisor realized, too late, that he had revealed too much. Nobles gasped. Guards looked at each other. The air thickened with realization. The advisor had not denied the affair. He had confirmed it. The king turned slowly toward him, his expression unreadable. You knew. The advisor flinched. Your Majesty, You knew, the king repeated, voice low and trembling. All these years, you knew. The advisor opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kairo took a step forward, his voice raw. So it's true, all of it? You knew who my father was, and you punished her anyway? The advisor glared at him. You were a threat, he hissed, unable to stop himself. A disgrace, a reminder of the king's worst mistake. The king bellowed, Enough! The advisor fell silent instantly. Everyone in the hall stared at the king, waiting for him to deny it, to curse the accusation, to save himself. But he didn't. He didn't deny the affair. He didn't deny the child. He didn't deny the past. Instead, he stared at Kairo with a haunted expression, one that seemed to shake the foundations beneath his feet. Kairo took a breath. Why? His voice trembled. Why didn't you protect her? The king swallowed hard, struggling to speak. I was young, foolish, weak. I bowed to pressure, to fear. I hid what happened, and I let her suffer for it. The advisor's eyes bulged in panic. Your Majesty, you must not admit. Silence! The king thundered again. The advisor fell back, his arrogance crumbling into terror. Kairo's mother knelt behind him, tears falling onto the marble floor, but Kairo stood tall. His voice cracked as he said, You let them treat her like she was nothing. The king closed his eyes as if struck. I know. You let them hurt her. Yes, you let them hurt me. The king's voice broke. I know. And you did nothing to stop it. The king did not answer. Silence was answer enough. Kairo's mother let out a weak sob. He knelt beside her, holding her trembling body tightly. His voice lowered, but every corner of the hall heard him. "She protected me all my life," he said. "Now I'm protecting her." Then he stood again, turning back to the king. "This kingdom can bow to you," he said, voice steady. "But I won't." The hall waited, breathless. And the king, for the first time in his reign, looked truly afraid. The hall was still vibrating with the echo of Kairo's words when his mother slowly lifted her head. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her wrists bound, her posture weak from exhaustion. But something in her eyes had changed. The fear was still there. Yes, trembling at the edges. But beneath it, something stronger had begun to rise. Truth. And truth, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. She drew a long, shaking breath, and for the first time since being dragged into the throne room, she looked straight at the king, really looked at him. "You were not supposed to know," she whispered to Kairo, her voice barely holding together. "I tried to keep you safe. I tried to carry the weight alone." "Mun," Kairo whispered, touching her shoulder. "You don't have to be silent anymore." Her eyes softened at the sound of his voice, but when she turned back toward the king, her expression hardened. The entire throne room leaned forward, sensing that something irreversible was about to be spoken. The king took a step back. Just one. But even one step from a monarch was enough to send panic rippling through the nobles. "Do not," he began, his voice tight. "Speak of what happened." But she shook her head. "I am done being silent." Gasps fluttered through the hall like frightened birds. Servants at the edges stared with wide eyes, too terrified to blink. The advisor tensed, mouth twisting, realizing with dread that he could no longer control the direction of the moment. She lifted her bound hand slightly, the ropes cutting into her skin, and for a moment, she looked not like a servant kneeling before her king, but like a woman reclaiming the life stolen from her. "You asked who he is," she said softly. "You already know." The king's face tightened, the muscles in his jaw jumping. "Enough," he warned. But she continued. "It was a long time ago," she began, voice trembling but clear. "Before Kairo was born. I was young. I worked in the palace laundry. You were not yet hardened by the throne. You were kind. Or at least I thought you were." Kairo felt his chest tighten. He had imagined many possibilities, but hearing the truth spilled into the open like this felt both unreal and inevitable. "You would come to the courtyard at night to escape your duties," she continued. "You wanted to talk to someone who wasn't afraid of you, someone who didn't care about titles, someone who didn't bow." The king's eyes flickered, not with anger this time, but with memory. "You spoke to me," she whispered. "Not like a king, like a man. You asked my name. You told me yours. And you said..." Her voice faltered, cracking. "You said I was the only person in the palace who looked at you like you were human." A shocked murmur traveled across the nobles. The idea that their king had once sought comfort in a servant, a black servant, seemed to horrify them more than any crime. The mother continued, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You said you admired my strength, my honesty. You said I made you feel free." She took another breath that quivered through her entire body. "And I foolishly believed you." The king flinched as she spoke. He had not expected her to reveal the tenderness of their beginning, the vulnerability he had once shown. "Then one night," she said, staring directly at him, "everything changed." The hall fell silent again. "It was raining," she whispered. "I stayed late to finish the washing. You came to the laundry room soaked through, miserable with the weight of your duties. You told me the nobles treated you like a puppet. You told me you envied me for being able to walk freely." A tear slid down her cheek. "And then, you kissed me." The hall erupted. Noblewomen shrieked. Noblemen shouted. The advisors and generals turned pale as ghosts. Guards stiffened in shock. Even the servants watching from the shadows gasped, covering their mouths with trembling hands. The king closed his eyes, not in denial, not in anger, but in memory. Kairo's breath hitched painfully. He felt every word like a stone thrown into his chest. "I tried to tell you it was wrong," she said. "I tried to pull away, but you said you cared for me. You said you wanted something real, something untainted by politics." "Kneel!" a noble shouted. "This is treason!" But she ignored him. "You promised me," she whispered to the king, tears pouring silently now, "that you would protect me." The king bowed his head slightly, not enough to be called regret, but close enough that the entire hall saw it. "And when I became with child," her voice broke, "I had no one. You told me to hide it, to pretend nothing had happened. You said it would destroy your future." She shook her head slowly. "So I hid. I hid my belly. I hid my shame. I hid my son." Kairo felt dizzy. "Man," she touched his cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear he hadn't realized had fallen. "You were the greatest blessing of my life." But I lived in fear every day that someone would notice, that someone would ask why my child had your eyes. The hall stiffened, dozens of eyes darting between Kairo and the king. Because now that they knew to look, they saw it. Not in color, not in skin, but in shape. In the way anger tightened their jaws the same way. In the boldness in their eyes. The advisor lunged forward. "Your Majesty, she is manipulating you. She is attempting to seize power through lies." But for once, the king did not silence her. He said nothing. He only stared at Kairo with a devastation too raw to hide. She drew her final breath before the truth spilled from her like a wound finally allowed to bleed. "I kept your secret," she whispered. "I bore the punishment. I bore the shame. I endured every insult, every slap, every cruelty, so that you would not have to face what you did." The king stepped back as if slapped. "And now," she said, her voice turning into a quiet, trembling fire, "you want to punish me for the consequences of your own sin." The hall froze. Her truth was no longer a whisper. It was a flame, and it set the kingdom on fire. "I will not kneel anymore," she said, lifting her chin through her tears. "Not to a king who let me bleed alone. Not to a man who pretended I did not exist." The king's lips parted. But before he could speak, Kairo rose. His mother's truth had lit something inside him that would never go dark again. The throne room had become a battlefield without swords. Every word the mother spoke struck like an arrow, every silence from the king like a wound. And now, as the truth stood exposed before nobles and servants alike, the kingdom felt as though it was teetering on the edge of something that could never be undone. Kairo rose slowly, his breaths uneven, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear nothing else. He looked at the king, not with fear this time, but with a rawness that made the monarch flinch. The boy no longer saw a ruler. He saw a man, a flawed, guilty man who had once chosen cowardice over responsibility. A man who had let a lie become law. "Say something," Kairo whispered. The words trembled in the air, fragile yet impossible to ignore. The king swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then forced himself to meet the boy's eyes. All the fury from earlier was gone. What remained was something far more unsettling: shame. "It is true," the king finally said. Chaos erupted instantly. Nobles rose to their feet, shouting over one another. "Outrage! Impossible! Disgrace! Illegitimate!" Some demanded the mother be silenced. Others demanded the boy be removed. A few, surprisingly few, stood in stunned silence, their perfectly crafted worlds collapsing under the weight of the king's admission. The guards looked lost, unsure whether to draw swords or fall to their knees. Servants at the edges stared with trembling hands pressed to their mouths, unable to believe what they had witnessed. The kingdom's most guarded secret had just been confessed in public, and not by accident, but by force of truth. Kairo stared at the king, his throat tight. "Why didn't you protect us?" The king closed his eyes. "Because I was weak." His voice cracked. "Because if the nobles found out I had a child with a servant..." He glanced at the watching faces, each one sharpened with judgment. They would have taken everything from me. My crown, my throne, my legacy. Kairo stepped closer. So you protected your throne and let us suffer for it. The king didn't deny it. He looked down, as though the weight of every year of silence finally crushed the last remnants of his pride. Yes. The hall quivered with gasps and murmurs. No one had ever heard the king admit fault. No one had heard him confess weakness. He had always stood untouchable, unbreakable. But truth had broken through a place even swords couldn't reach. The advisor took advantage of the moment, sweeping to the center of the hall, his robe swirling like a serpent coiling to strike. Your Majesty, this cannot stand. She lies to elevate herself. That boy is nothing but... Enough, the king said, but his voice was too soft, too slow. The advisor kept talking. She has tainted the throne with her lies. We must remove them both and restore order before the kingdom collapses. A furious murmur rose among the nobles, many nodding vigorously. They preferred the advisor's certainty to the king's guilt. Order, they believed, came from crushing the vulnerable, not confronting the truth. Kairo's hands curled into fists. For the first time, he understood how much power the advisor truly held. He wasn't merely a servant of the king, he shaped the king's fears, fed them, weaponized them. And now he hoped to bury the truth again under the rubble of violence. Kairo stepped forward. You hate her because she never bowed to you. The advisor froze. You hate me, Kairo continued, because I exist. The advisor's face twisted. You are an abomination. Several nobles gasped. Others whispered, nodding behind fans and gloved fingers. Kairo lifted his chin higher. I'm not an abomination. I'm not a mistake. I'm not a secret you get to hide. He placed his hand on his mother's shoulder. I am her son, and she is worth more than all of you. The advisor lunged forward, voice cracking with fury. You insolent! Touch him, the king finally said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, and I will have your head. Silence slammed down over the hall. The advisor stared in horror, realizing what had just happened. The king, despite everything, had protected the boy, had threatened a man of highest authority, had chosen a servant child over a noble. You would choose him? The advisor sputtered. This half-blood bastard child and over your kingdom? The king stepped forward, eyes blazing. My kingdom was never yours to define. The advisor staggered back as though slapped. Kairo's mother wept silently, her tears falling in disbelief. Kairo knelt beside her, brushing her hair back from her face and whispered, It's over now, Mai. But she shook her head weakly. No, meu amor. It's only just begun. She was right, because even as the king turned toward the crowd to silence them, even as guards hesitated, even as the nobles whispered in stunned outrage, the kingdom was splitting in two right before Kairo's eyes. On one side were those who believed the truth was a threat. On the other, those who recognized the truth as justice long overdue. The king raised his hand, forcing the room into uneasy quiet. I was wrong, he said. I abandoned them. I allowed lies and fear to guide me. I let my own son suffer. I will make amends. The nobles erupted again, shouting, arguing, scandalized. But Kairo didn't care about them. He looked only at his mother, who looked back at him with trembling pride. The king turned to him, eyes shining with guilt. Kairo, he said softly. The name shook the hall. No one had ever heard the king say it. You deserve a place in this kingdom, the king continued. A name, a title, protection, everything I denied you. Kairo rose slowly, staring at the man who had fathered him and abandoned him. A hush fell, and Kairo spoke the words that divided the kingdom one last time. I don't want your throne, he said, or your name. I only want justice. The hall erupted in flames of rebellion and disbelief, and for the first time ever, the king understood what real power was. Not in crowns, not in armies, not in blood, but in truth. A truth spoken by a boy who refused to kneel. The throne room no longer felt like a hall built of stone and gold. It felt alive, pulled between breaths, suspended in a trembling silence that threatened to shatter at any moment. Kairo stood at the center of it all, his chest rising and falling, his mother's bound hands resting against him as though she needed to feel his heartbeat just to stay grounded. The king stared at them, at the son he had denied and the woman he had abandoned. And for the first time in his reign, he looked small. The nobles were no longer whispering. They were arguing now, loudly, viciously, their voices clashing in mid-air like dueling swords. Some demanded the mother be exiled for daring to speak. Others insisted the boy be punished for defiance. A few, very few, murmured that perhaps the kingdom had been blind for too long. A guard stepped forward hesitantly. "Your Majesty, your command." The king didn't answer. He looked instead at the throne, his throne, as though wondering how much of that power had ever truly belonged to him. He lifted a trembling hand to his crown, and Kairo watched something break in the man's eyes. Not anger, not pride, fear. Fear of himself, fear of what he had become, fear of what his silence had created. "Kairo," he said, his voice barely carrying, "I cannot undo the years you suffered, nor the pain she endured because of me." Kairo's mother flinched. The words were daggers sharpened by truth. The king continued, "But I can ensure it ends today." The advisor lunged forward, losing the last shreds of restraint. "Your Majesty, you must not. If you accept that woman's story, if you acknowledge this boy, your entire reign will collapse." The king turned to him sharply. "My reign collapsed the moment I let fear rule me." The advisor froze. The king motioned to the guards. "Unbind her." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, cautiously, the guards stepped forward and cut the ropes around her wrists. The hemp fell away, leaving angry red marks across her skin. She cradled her wrists, exhaling a shaky breath she had held for years, decades even. Kairo helped her to her feet. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she stood. For the first time in the throne room, she stood. The king walked closer, stopping just a breath away from them. He hesitated, an unfamiliar expression softening the sharp lines of his face. "I should have protected you," he whispered to her. "Both of you." She looked at him with a pain so deep it hollowed the space between them. "You protected your crown," she said. "Not us." He bowed his head, a king lowering himself not to a foreign ruler, but to the graveyard of his own sins. Kairo stepped slightly in front of his mother, not out of fear, but instinct. The king's eyes lifted to the boy, and for a moment the hall seemed to shrink until only the two of them existed. "I can give you everything I never gave," the king said softly. "A name, a title, a life worthy of what you are." Kairo felt the weight of every gaze in the room press against his back. Nobles waiting for scandal, guards waiting for orders, servants waiting for hope. And his mother, trembling behind him, waiting for him to choose the path she once never had the power to walk. Kairo inhaled slowly. "I don't want your name." A ripple of shock swept through the hall. "I don't want your throne," he continued. "I want my mother to be safe. I want her to be free. I want her to walk through this palace without fear." The king nodded painfully. "Then she will." But Kairo wasn't finished. "And the other servants, the ones treated like shadows, the ones who kneel because they'll be punished if they don't. I want them protected too." For the first time, true fire flickered in the king's eyes. Not rage, but resolve. "Then I will change this kingdom," the advisor exploded. "You cannot. The nobles will revolt. The court will—" The king raised his hand. "Guards!" Two guards seized the advisor immediately. He struggled, eyes bulging with rage. "You'll regret this. She manipulated you. That boy is poison. The kingdom will crumble." The king stepped closer to him, voice low. "The kingdom is crumbling because of men like you." He turned to the guards. "Take him to the dungeon. He will stand trial for corruption and treason." The hall erupted in gasps as the advisor was dragged away, screaming curses that echoed off the marble walls until they faded into nothing. Silence returned, but it was different now. Not heavy with fear, but trembling with change. The king faced the hall. This woman will no longer serve in the palace. She will live here as a free subject under royal protection. Any harm done to her will be harm done to me. The nobles recoiled. And her son, the king added, looking at Kairo with a softness that surprised even him, will be granted the rights of any citizen of this kingdom. Kairo swallowed, unsure how to respond to a gesture he had never expected. But the king shook his head gently. I know you do not want my name, but you deserve my protection. Kairo's mother gripped his hand tightly, her eyes shining. Meu filho, she whispered. This is more than I ever dreamed. But Kairo wasn't thinking about dreams. He was thinking about the weight of the world on her shoulders for so long, and how it finally lifted. Not because the king granted mercy, but because she spoke truth. He turned to the king. I am not a shadow anymore. The king nodded. No, you are the only one in this hall who truly stood tall. And then, something unimaginable happened. The king lowered himself, slowly, painfully, deliberately. He knelt. The hall gasped as their ruler bent his knees before the boy who had refused to bend before him. Kairo's throat tightened. His mother covered her mouth to hold back a sob. The king looked up at them from the ground. A king must kneel, he said, when he has wronged his own blood. Kairo stepped back, overwhelmed, shaking with the weight of the moment. He helped his mother take one step forward, then another, until they stood inches from the kneeling king. And for the first time in his life, Kairo understood power, not the kind worn on a head, but the kind carried in a spine that refused to bow. He whispered, barely audible, We forgive you, but we will not kneel. The king closed his eyes, accepting the truth. Kairo took his mother's hand. Together, they walked out of the throne room, unbound, unbroken, unbowed. And behind them, the kingdom finally began to rise.